It was a Wednesday like any other in the village of Milchester, with a crispness in the late spring air that hinted at rain, but failed to deliver it. The hedgerows were bright with dogrose and elderflower, and the birdsong was so cheerfully excessive that even the rector's cat paused on the churchyard wall, tail twitching, as if listening. At precisely 2 o'clock, the members of the Milchester Ladies' Garden Club gathered at the vicarage for their monthly meeting. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, a fact much commented upon by Mrs. Price Ridley, who took a great deal of credit for them, though they grew in someone else's garden. It was to be an afternoon of strawberry scones, chamomile tea, and a lecture on cultivating alpine rockeries delivered by Major Bertram Fothergill, a man whose voice could make the topic of soil drainage sound like an act of war. Miss Marple arrived slightly late, as was her habit, with a soft smile and a modest grey. Hat pinned just so, she moved gently through the seated ladies like a well-behaved ghost, exchanging a few quiet pleasantries before settling into a wicker chair near the hydrangeas. Few noticed her. That was the way she preferred it. The sun was playing hide-and-seek through the garden parasols when the first strange thing occurred. "You'd think someone had been raised in a barn," muttered Mrs. Bantry, sniffing toward the vicarage porch. "Leaving an umbrella wide open in the hallway like that, indoors of all places." Indeed, there it was, an umbrella fully open and leaning against the wall just inside the house, black and severe against the vicarage's floral wallpaper. It hadn't been raining, and no one could recall seeing anyone carry it in. "Oh, that's bad luck, that is," said Miss Hartnell, who kept a drawer full of lavender sachets and an equal number of superstitions. "Inviting death into the home." "Poppycock," said Colonel Denham, who had come only for the scones. "It's probably drying out. Someone's just being practical." Miss Marple, uncharacteristically, said nothing. The talk quickly moved on what didn't in Milchester, but Miss Marple's blue eyes rested on the umbrella for a moment longer, her expression unreadable. Tea was served. The Major droned on about miniature sedums and slope gradients, and a small cluster of bees, made a brief foray into the strawberry jam. Life, in short, went on exactly as it always had, until it didn't. For it was at that very same garden club meeting, among the neatly tended flower beds and sweet-scented chatter, that Mrs. Lavinia Greer failed to arrive. And that was most unlike her. Lavinia Greer, a widow of independent means and unrelenting punctuality, never missed a meeting. She once arrived with a broken ankle and had spent the entire time quoting Gertrude Jekyll while sipping tea through gritted teeth. She must have been waylaid, said Reverend Stokes with a fretful wrinkle between his brows. Perhaps the car wouldn't start. But as the afternoon faded into a gentle dusk, and no word arrived, and no one answered the telephone at Lavender Cottage, an unease began to settle over the assembled guests, like a fog rolling in from the moor. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and the garden chairs had been folded away, the vicar's housekeeper would remark that the open umbrella had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. By morning, the local constable would find Mrs. Lavinia Greer's body at the foot of her own cellar stairs, neck broken, eyes wide open, and a smear of mud on the carpet just inside her door. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly by her parlour window knitting, a pale blue baby bonnet for her niece's grandchild, and thinking, as she often did, of human wickedness hidden beneath polite smiles. And somewhere in the neat tangle of hedges and rose trellises of Milchester, a murderer was sipping tea and pretending that nothing at all was amiss. The news travelled through Milchester with the efficiency and speed of a wind-blown dandelion. By mid-morning, the day after the garden club meeting, the entire village knew that Mrs. Lavinia Greer had been found dead in her home. No sooner had Constable Reeves cordoned off Lavender Cottage, with a length of borrowed twine and awkward authority, than speculation took firm root in every parlour, bakery, and hedgerow. "She slipped, of course," said Mrs. Price Ridley, seated prominently at the window table of the tea shop, her voice low enough to be confidential, loud enough to be overheard. "Terrible eyesight, always reading in dim light, that woman. She probably missed a step entirely." "I heard there was mud," offered Miss Hartnell, eyes wide over the rim of her teacup. "On the carpet, just inside the door. That's not usual, is it?" "Perhaps she was outside," ventured young Milly Crane, who had taken to visiting the tea shop often since returning from her work in London. "You know, perhaps she stepped out for something, then came back in, then—" "Why was the front gate still locked?" interrupted Mr. Barnes, the village postmaster, who prided himself on knowing things before others. "That's what Reeves said. Had to climb over the hedge himself just to get in." The mention of Reeves prompted collective silence. No one wanted to admit they'd been eavesdropping at the scene. It wasn't proper, but Milchester was not, a place where silence lasted long. "She was frightened of that cellar," said Mrs. Bantry, frowning thoughtfully. "Refused to have anything stored down there. Told me once she felt something lurking in the corners. Why on earth would she have gone down those steps?" No one had an answer, though a few sipped their tea more slowly, as if the answer might surface in the dregs. Meanwhile, Miss Marple walked quietly through the village, basket in hand, her step steady on the cobblestones. She greeted no fewer than 6 people on her way to the greengrocer's, each one pausing to share some opinion on the tragedy at Lavender Cottage. Miss Marple listened kindly, nodding in the right places, but offered very little of her own. Her thoughts, as ever, were busy behind the mild blue eyes and unassuming expression. She had known Lavinia Greer since before the war, had seen her arrive in Milchester as the young bride of Thomas Greer, who had succumbed to pneumonia barely 2 winters later. Lavinia had stayed on, grown into herself, and gradually transformed her modest home into one of the most meticulous properties in the village. Her curtains were always drawn at the same time each evening, her garden was ruthlessly trimmed, and she kept a small brass bell on the gatepost to announce visitors. It was the kind of life that suggested control and order, and very little room for accidents. That afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by the vicarage with a jar of preserved gooseberries, a polite excuse more than a gift. She knew from long practice that housekeepers and vicars alike were treasure troves of small, important details. "Terrible, eh? Business, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Finch, the vicar's housekeeper, as she accepted the jar with flustered gratitude, and after she'd RSVP'd so promptly too. Always the first to reply, Mrs. Greer. So courteous. "Yes," murmured Miss Marple. She was rather a stickler for formalities, wasn't she? "Oh, terribly so. Never let anyone pass the front door unless their shoes were spotless." Mrs. Finch sniffed. "And such a neat house, not a speck out of place. The sort of woman who would notice a button gone missing from your cuff." "Then she would have noticed a patch of mud on the carpet," said Miss Marple, more to herself than to the housekeeper. Mrs. Finch blinked. "You mean, you think someone else tracked it in?" Miss Marple didn't answer. She turned slightly, eyes landing on the empty hall. "And that umbrella yesterday," she said softly. "Did you ever find out who left it?" Mrs. Finch shook her head. No one claimed it disappeared later in the evening. The Major thought someone had simply fetched it on the way out. But Miss Marple remembered something different. She remembered that no one had arrived with an umbrella, and certainly no one had left in weather that warranted one. And umbrellas, in her experience, were rarely forgotten by accident. They were either abandoned on purpose or used as a ruse. Later that evening, the village constable stopped by the vicarage to give his official statement. Reverend Stokes invited Miss Marple to sit in, which she did with the quiet deference of a woman who saw more from the edges of the room than most did from the centre. "Accidental death, most likely," Reeves declared, his thick notebook clutched to his chest. "No sign of forced entry, no valuables missing. The fall down the cellar stairs was fatal, broken neck, nasty business." "But she didn't use the cellar," said the Reverend. "She told my wife it gave her the creeps." Reeves shifted. "Yes, well, people do odd things when they're distracted. Was anything out of place? Miss Marple asked gently. Reeves considered her, then sighed. A few things, yes. The back latch wasn't fastened, but it didn't appear tampered with. No signs of a struggle. But there was this. He pulled a folded handkerchief from his pocket and unwrapped something small. Dull silver with flecks of enamel. An umbrella. Tip, he said. Found wedged under the coat rack near the front hall. Doesn't match anything in the house. Miss Marple took a small breath. So the umbrella was there, she murmured. What umbrella? Reeves looked puzzled. Miss Marple waved her hand gently. Oh, just a silly thing. It was open indoors during the garden club, quite unusual. Reeves nodded slowly, tucking the tip back into his pocket. Well, perhaps someone brought it with them. Maybe paid Mrs. Greer a visit before the meeting and left it open at the vicarage instead. Miss Marple raised a brow. There was a pause. Then the vicar spoke quietly. You think someone may have gone to see her before the meeting, argued with her perhaps, or pretended to be dropping by with something innocuous, said Miss Marple. People are often less cautious when they expect kindness. The constable frowned. But no signs of violence. It's all very tidy. Doesn't seem like the work of an intruder. No, said Miss Marple. Not an intruder, perhaps, but someone she knew. Someone with just enough cunning to make a push look like a stumble. Reeves opened his mouth to reply, then closed it again. He glanced at Miss Marple uneasily. That night, as twilight folded over the village and the last of the gossip dwindled into bedtime silences, Miss Marple sat by her parlour window once more, her knitting untouched in her lap. She was thinking about umbrellas, about mud, about women who were not inclined to descend into cellars, and about what kind of person opened an umbrella indoors. Not by accident, but by design. The morning after the discovery of Mrs. Lavinia Greer's body, Milchester awoke under a blanket of uneasy silence. The village seemed smaller somehow, as if the cosy, comfortable fabric of daily life had been abruptly snagged and pulled loose. The post office, usually bustling with idle chatter and the rustling of newspapers, held a quieter air, punctuated only by the soft ticking of the wall clock. Miss Marple made her way to Lavender Cottage, having received permission from the constable to visit the scene. The house was still cordoned off by Reeves's hastily erected twine, but the constable had no objection to her passing through the front gate. The garden, usually so meticulously kept, was a little wild around the edges, as though the absence of its owner had left the greenery uncertain. She stepped inside, the faint scent of lavender and beeswax lingering in the air. The housekeeper had been diligent in maintaining the house's order even after the tragedy, but there was a subtle disorder. A chair slightly askew, a teacup left half full on the kitchen table, that spoke of haste and disruption. Miss Marple's sharp eyes swept over every detail, committing each to memory. Her gaze drifted to the hall, where the umbrella had been left open the day before. Now it was nowhere to be found. The black canopy that had drawn Mrs. Bantry's disapproval was gone as if it had never existed. Miss Marple knelt by the coat rack where the umbrella tip had been found wedged and noticed a faint smudge of mud on the polished floor. She crouched closer and gently touched it, confirming it was fresh. As she rose, a soft cough made her turn. Standing in the doorway was Inspector Harold Reeves, his uniform slightly rumpled, but his expression serious. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I thought you might want to see something." He led her into the kitchen, where a small table was laid out with photographs, notes, and a leather-bound diary. "We found these in Mrs. Greer's room," Reeves explained. "Her diary, mostly. It's quite something." Miss Marple took the diary with gentle hands and flipped it open. The handwriting was neat, with occasional flourishes, but the entries were terse and sometimes cryptic, Several pages referenced a dispute with an unnamed person, described only as he or the visitor. There were mentions of secrecy, betrayal, and a deal broken. "This is a clue," Miss Marple murmured. "Someone close enough to Mrs. Greer to warrant secrecy, and enough to cause anxiety." Reeves nodded, pointing to a photograph. It was a grainy snapshot of a man standing at the edge of the village pond, partially obscured by a willow. His expression was unreadable, but his posture suggested tension. "Who's this?" Miss Marple asked. "That's Mr. Peter Langley," said Reeves. "A businessman from London. He's been visiting the village regularly over the past few months." "And what's his connection to Mrs. Greer?" Reeves hesitated. "That's what we're trying to find out." Miss Marple closed the diary, her mind working quietly. "I would like to speak with Mr. Langley." Reeves agreed and promised to arrange it. Meanwhile, Miss Marple left Lavender Cottage with a renewed sense of purpose. As she walked back through the village, she observed the residents more keenly than before. There was Mrs. Price Ridley, who now looked uneasy, as if her earlier confidence had been shaken. The baker, Mr. Hargreaves, was unusually silent, wiping his hands on his apron as he watched a small group of children playing nearby. Miss Marple's gaze settled on a narrow alley where a figure slipped quietly out of sight. She noted the quick glance cast over a shoulder before the figure disappeared behind a hedge. Curious, she made a mental note to inquire further. Later that afternoon, she attended a gathering at the village hall where many of the villagers had congregated to discuss the tragedy. Voices were hushed but charged with speculation. "I can't believe Lavinia is gone," said Mrs. Bantry, dabbing at her eyes. "She was so proper, so careful." "Proper, yes, but not without secrets," whispered Miss Hartnell from behind her lace handkerchief. There was a murmur of agreement, and Miss Marple observed the shifting expressions around the room. She could see the mask of civility cracking, revealing fears and resentment simmering beneath the surface. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but carried the weight of quiet authority. "Sometimes the truth is not where we expect to find it. People hide behind good manners, but their actions tell another story." Several heads nodded, but no one challenged her. Miss Marple continued, "I would ask that everyone think carefully about who might have had reason to wish harm on Mrs. Greer. No detail is too small." That evening, she received a visitor, a young woman named Emily Cartwright, who worked at the village library. Emily was nervous but determined. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I thought you might want to know that Mr. Langley has been seen visiting the old mill on the outskirts of the village late at night." "Is that so?" Miss Marple replied. Her interest piqued. "Yes. And there's talk he's involved in some business dealings that aren't quite right. Some villagers are wary of him." Miss Marple thanked her and made a note to visit the mill the following day. As the night deepened and the village settled into uneasy sleep, Miss Marple sat by her window once more, knitting absent-mindedly. Her thoughts circled around the diary, the mysterious visitor, and the umbrella that had silently introduced itself into the scene like a dark omen. In Milchester, appearances could be deceiving, and beneath the polite smiles and floral curtains lay secrets waiting to be uncovered. Miss Marple knew that with patience, observation, and a touch of empathy, the tangled threads would begin to unravel, and when they did, the truth, however bitter, would come to light. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, the kind of day that seemed to cloak the village in a veil of sombre reflection. Miss Marple, with her usual quiet determination, set out for the old mill on the outskirts of Milchester. The path was narrow, flanked by hedgerows still thick with spring's first green. As she walked, she observed the subtle signs of village life awakening, an early chirp of birds, a distant bleat of sheep, and the occasional clatter of a cart over cobblestones. The old mill was a relic from a bygone era, its weathered stone walls softened by climbing ivy and moss. Once a hub of industrious activity, it now stood silent, its wheel long since stilled, a place more of memories than present-day business. Yet as Miss Marple approached, she noticed fresh footprints in the damp earth leading toward a side entrance, partially concealed by a heavy curtain of ivy. She paused, eyes narrowing as she surveyed the area. The footprints were uneven and hurried, and one set bore the unmistakable pattern of a man's leather shoe. Miss Marple crouched to examine a discarded cigarette butt lying near the entrance. She recognized the brand, a popular one yet peculiar for the village's usual habits. Before she could study further, a voice startled her from behind. "Miss Marple." It was Mr. Reeves, who had arrived quietly without her noticing. "I thought you might be here." She smiled faintly. "Inspector, I wondered if you'd be investigating this place today." "Indeed. Mr. Langley's movements have become a matter of interest, especially after the diary revealed his connection to Mrs. Greer." Together, they stepped into the shadowed interior. The mill's dusty beams and creaking floorboards echoed faintly beneath their feet. A musty odor hung in the air, mingled with the faint scent of engine oil and something more elusive, perhaps the faintest trace of perfume. Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward a small pile of papers scattered near a rusted workbench. Among them was a torn envelope, its edges frayed, and a scrap of parchment with hastily scribbled numbers. She picked them up gingerly. Business documents, perhaps, Reeves suggested. "Or a code," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "But what they mean is yet to be uncovered." Reeves nodded and pulled out his notebook. "We'll have them examined. Meanwhile, we should question Mr. Langley directly. Later." That morning, Miss Marple and the inspector made their way to the Langley residence, a modest but well-kept cottage near the village's edge. Mr. Langley was waiting in the parlour, a man of refined bearing but with an undercurrent of tension in his manner. His dark eyes flickered with a mixture of curiosity and wariness as he greeted his visitors. "Mr. Langley," Miss Marple began gently, "we understand you had business with Mrs. Greer." Langley's lips tightened. "I did, yes. It was a matter of some urgency, though nothing nefarious, I assure you." "Would you mind telling us more?" Reeves asked. Langley hesitated, then sighed. "Mrs. Greer was involved in a property dispute. She owned a parcel of land adjoining mine, and there were complications over access rights and boundaries." Miss Marple observed the subtle tension in his voice and the flicker of impatience in his eyes. "And these complications, might they have led to disagreements?" Langley's expression hardened. "We had differences of opinion, certainly, but nothing that would warrant suspicion." Yet, as the questioning continued, Miss Marple noticed his gaze drift toward a corner of the room where a finely embroidered handkerchief lay folded. It reminded her of the one found at the scene. "Mr. Langley, may I?" she asked softly, lifting the handkerchief. He stiffened. "That belongs to my sister." An interesting detail, Miss Marple thought, filing it away for later. As they left the cottage, Reeves expressed his concerns. "He's evasive, and his story doesn't quite add up." Miss Marple nodded but reminded him, "Evasiveness is often a shield. The truth may yet lie elsewhere." Back in the village, the atmosphere was thickening with unease. News of the investigation had spread like wildfire, igniting gossip and speculation. At the local tea room, voices were hushed but charged with undercurrents of accusation. Mrs. Bantry, perched at her usual table, clutched her teacup with trembling fingers. "I can't imagine anyone in Milchester capable of such violence," she whispered. Miss Hartnell, seated opposite, countered sharply, "Oh, but everyone has secrets, don't they? Especially in a village as quiet as ours." Miss Marple, who had joined the group unannounced, sipped her tea calmly. "Secrets are like buried roots," she remarked, "invisible until disturbed, but powerful enough to topple the mightiest tree." Her words hung in the air as the conversation shifted to the other villagers. Mr. Hargreaves, the baker, who had seemed nervous during questioning. Emily Cartwright, the librarian, whose knowledge of local affairs was deeper than many realized. And even the quiet Reverend Clark, who was known for his discretion, but was not without his own burdens. Later that day, Miss Marple received a call from Emily Cartwright, requesting to meet at the library. When she arrived, Emily was waiting, with a bundle of old newspapers and parish records spread out before her. "I did some digging," Emily said breathlessly. "Mrs. Greer's family history is more complicated than anyone knew. There were rumors of a scandal involving her brother. He disappeared under suspicious circumstances decades ago." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Do you think there might be a connection to the present?" Emily nodded slowly. "It's possible. There's also talk that the property Mrs. Greer owned was part of a trust, and if certain conditions were met, it could be sold for a substantial sum." The pieces were coming together, but the puzzle remained incomplete. Miss Marple felt the faintest thrill of anticipation. The village's serene facade was cracking, revealing tangled roots of old grievances, hidden debts, and unspoken betrayals. As she left the library, the sky darkened with the promise of rain. The umbrella that had sparked such quiet suspicion seemed to hover again in her thoughts, not merely a mundane object, but a symbol of secrets left uncovered, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Miss Marple knew the coming days would demand patience, sharp observation, and the careful unraveling of human nature's complexities. The truth was near, hidden in plain sight among the whispers and shadows of Milchester, and she was ready to find it. The rain fell steadily that afternoon, cloaking Milchester in a soft, persistent drizzle that blurred the edges of the village's familiar contours. Miss Marple, wrapped in her usual shawl, stepped delicately through puddles on the way to her cottage. The dampness seemed to press the silence more heavily upon the streets, as if the village itself were holding its breath in anticipation. The four revelations at the library still lingered in her mind, a tangled web of old scandals and land disputes threading ever deeper into the present mystery. Inside her cozy sitting room, the fire crackled gently, casting flickering shadows that danced against the walls lined with books and knickknacks collected over the years. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, smoothing the folds of her skirt, and setting aside her umbrella, which even now felt curiously significant. She glanced once more at the carefully folded handkerchief she had taken from Mr. Langley's home, its delicate embroidery distinct, the monogram almost too precise to be accidental. Her thoughts drifted back to the scattered papers in the mill and the strange series of numbers scribbled on that scrap of parchment. Something about them hinted at a code, a puzzle waiting to be solved. But how it connected to the land dispute or to the murder remained elusive. Yet the quiet persistence of these clues reminded her that appearances were often deceptive. The evening brought an unexpected knock at the door. It was Mrs. Bantry, flushed from the rain, eyes bright with urgency. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding, but I heard you were home and thought you might like to hear something." "Do come in, Mrs. Bantry," Miss Marple said, offering her a seat by the fire. "What news has stirred you so?" Mrs. Bantry settled herself, wringing a damp handkerchief nervously. "It's about Mr. Hargreaves. I overheard a conversation this afternoon when I was at the bakery. He was talking to the assistant about money, debts, and some trouble with his creditors. It sounded serious, and I can't help but wonder if it might be connected." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Financial troubles can sometimes be a powerful motive. Did you catch any details about the nature of these debts?" "Not exactly," Mrs. Bantry admitted. "But the assistant mentioned something about a loan that was overdue and a meeting set for tomorrow at the village hall." The mention of a meeting piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. "Thank you for telling me. Such matters are rarely as simple as they seem." As Mrs. Bantry left, promising to keep her ears open, Miss Marple prepared for a quiet night of contemplation. But sleep came fitfully, her mind turning over the fragments of conversation, the hidden histories, and the carefully concealed motives. The next morning, the village hall buzzed quietly with early risers gathered for the unexpected meeting Mr. Hargreaves had arranged. Miss Marple arrived unannounced, blending into the crowd. The baker stood at the front, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by a look of strained composure. He addressed the small assembly, explaining the financial difficulties threatening his business and appealing for support or understanding. Among those present, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a few faces that flickered with unease. Local shopkeepers who relied on Hargreaves's bread, as well as some villagers she knew to be less than sympathetic. One man in particular, Mr. Simmons, a property owner with long-standing grievances, seemed especially cold and calculating. After the meeting, Miss Marple lingered near the hall's entrance, observing as Mr. Hargreaves spoke in hushed tones with Mr. Simmons. Their exchange was brief but intense, with Simmons's fingers tapping impatiently on the wooden doorframe. Later, on her walk back, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern of conflict and desperation weaving through the village. The land disputes, the financial strains, the old family scandals, they were all pieces of the same intricate mosaic. Her thoughts returned to the diary, and a line she had not yet fully considered. Trust is the rarest coin. The phrase resonated now more than ever. Who in Milchester could be trusted, and who was wearing the mask of respectability to conceal darker intentions? The following afternoon, a sudden commotion disrupted the village's uneasy rhythm. A frantic cry rang from the market square, drawing a crowd. It was Emily Cartwright, the librarian, clutching a letter she had just discovered slipped beneath the library door. Miss Marple made her way through the gathering throng, curiosity sharpening her focus. The letter was unsigned but unmistakably a warning. A veiled threat aimed at someone connected to the Greer estate. The wording was cryptic, but chilling. The past cannot remain buried. Retribution comes with the storm. Whispers spread like wildfire. The threat hinted at a reckoning, a danger lurking just beneath the surface of Milchester's calm facade. Miss Marple studied the faces around her, fear, suspicion, and a flicker of defiance in equal measure. This letter was no idle threat. It was a call to action, a message from the shadows that would not be ignored. That evening, Miss Marple invited Emily to her home. Over tea, they pored over the letter's language, searching for clues. Emily shared more from her research into the Greer family history, revealing disputes over inheritance and a mysterious fire decades earlier that had destroyed some critical documents. The connection to the present was undeniable. Someone was desperate to keep certain truths hidden, and the letter was a warning to those who might seek to uncover them. Miss Marple's gaze drifted once more to the umbrella resting near the hearth. That simple object, left open indoors, seemed a quiet emblem of the disorder beneath Milchester's orderly exterior. A small act that, when seen through her eyes, spoke volumes about the invisible tension coiling through the village. As night deepened, Miss Marple's mind pieced together the growing web. The secrets, the grudges, the cryptic threats, all converged toward a reckoning that might shatter the fragile peace. But she knew that patience was as vital as insight. The next move belonged to those who thought themselves clever enough to hide in plain sight, and Miss Marple, with her gentle yet unyielding manner, was ready to watch, to listen, and when the moment came, to unravel the final threads. The days that followed the arrival of the ominous letter saw Milchester's usual placid routine begin to fracture under the weight of unspoken fears and shifting glances. At the bakery, business was quieter than usual. Customers seemed reluctant to linger, their conversations hushed and eyes darting toward the doorway. Miss Marple noted these subtle changes as she passed through the village, her keen eyes catching the nervous tension that threaded through even the smallest gestures. She visited the Greer estate one crisp morning, drawn by a desire to better, understand the tangled family dynamics that seem so central to the mystery. The house itself, a sprawling Victorian manor, stood imposing yet somehow diminished, as though bearing the burden of past sorrows within its very walls. Mrs. Greer, a woman of dignified bearing but visibly strained by recent events, welcomed Miss Marple into the drawing-room, where faded photographs and heavy curtains gave an air of quiet neglect. "It's been a difficult time," Mrs. Greer admitted softly, pouring tea with hands that trembled ever so slightly. "My husband's death still feels like a shadow cast over us all, and now this letter." She trailed off, eyes reflecting a mixture of sorrow and unease. Miss Marple nodded gently. The past has a way of surfacing when least expected. Sometimes those old wounds left to fester can shape present troubles in ways we might not immediately see. Mrs. Greer sighed. "The fire that destroyed some of our family's documents years ago always struck me as suspicious. There were rumors, of course, about a quarrel, a secret that someone wanted buried, but nothing was ever proven." "That is often how such secrets survive," Miss Marple mused. "They remain hidden behind smoke and silence until someone unintentionally or deliberately stirs the ashes." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock. The butler entered with a visitor, a tall man with an air of quiet authority that immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. Introducing himself as Inspector Barnaby, he explained that he had been assigned to assist with the investigation and was keen to speak with the family. After introductions, the inspector revealed he had questions about the recent movements around the estate. "Mrs. Greer, have you noticed anyone acting unusually? Visitors at odd hours, or perhaps someone with a grievance?" Mrs. Greer hesitated. "There was a man who came by a few days ago, asking about my late husband's affairs. He seemed very determined, almost desperate." "Did you recognize him?" Miss Marple inquired. "No, I did not," Mrs. Greer replied, "but he left a card, a Mr. Alistair Crane, a solicitor from London. He said he was investigating some matters related to the estate." The mention of the solicitor sparked a thought in Miss Marple's mind. London connections often meant the stirring up of long-dormant troubles, and such figures rarely appeared without cause. Later, over tea with Inspector Barnaby at the village inn, Miss Marple listened intently as he recounted the police's progress. "The investigation so far," he said, "has focused mainly on the more obvious suspects, those with immediate access to the Greer estate and the victims. But as you've suggested, Miss Marple, the situation is rarely as straightforward as it appears." She smiled faintly. "Indeed, motives can be layered, and people often wear masks more convincing than the truth beneath." Barnaby nodded appreciatively. "Your insights are valuable, as always." Miss Marple's mind returned to the letter, the cryptic warning about buried pasts and retribution. It was becoming clearer that the murder was more than a crime of passion or opportunity. It was an act entangled in years of hidden animosities and unspoken grievances. That evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple took a solitary walk toward the edge of the village, her path leading to the small garden adjoining for the Greer estate. The rain from days before had left the earth soft and fragrant, and the air held a chill that whispered of approaching change. She paused by the hedge, her gaze drawn to a figure standing near the garden gate, Mr. Simmons, the property owner with the sharp gaze and colder smile. He had been a presence throughout the unfolding drama, often lurking at the periphery but rarely stepping fully into view. "Good evening, Mr. Simmons," Miss Marple said softly. He turned, surprised but quickly masking it with a courteous nod. "Miss Marple, out for a stroll?" "Indeed. The night brings clarity, sometimes more than daylight." He chuckled, a sound tinged with something almost menacing beneath its civility. "You have a knack for seeing what others overlook, I'll give you that." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, faintly. One must keep watch in a village like ours. Secrets are the currency here." They stood in a brief silence, the tension between them almost tangible. "Do you believe the letter will change anything?" Mr. Simmons asked. "Change is always underway," she replied. "It's a matter of whether people are ready to face it." As he walked away, Miss Marple's thoughts were already weaving a new tapestry of possibilities. Mr. Simmons's presence so near the estate at odd hours, his earlier disagreements with Mr. Hargreaves over land rights, and now this quiet challenge. In his demeanour, these were threads that could not be ignored. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple found herself drawn once more to the small umbrella she had noticed at the scene of the murder. Left open indoors, a small breach of propriety, but, to her, a vital clue. She recalled her earlier reflections on this, the symbolism of something that should be closed yet was exposed, vulnerable. The next morning brought a startling development. Emily Cartwright arrived at Miss Marple's door, flushed with excitement and clutching a newly found document from the library archives. It was a letter, dated several decades prior, penned by a distant relative of the Greer family. Its contents spoke of a bitter feud over a parcel of land that had divided families and set enmities into motion that might well have endured far longer than anyone imagined. Miss Marple read the letter carefully, her mind racing to place it within the larger puzzle. The tone was bitter, accusatory, and suggested that the writer suspected foul play behind the fire that had destroyed the estate's records. More chillingly, it hinted that the family's troubles were far from over, that someone might still be seeking to settle old scores. The day wore on with conversations and quiet investigations. Miss Marple visited the village post office to inquire about the mysterious Mr. Alistair Crane, only to discover he had recently arrived in Milchester and had scheduled several private meetings, including one with Mr. Hargreaves himself. Miss Marple's web of connections grew tighter, the strands of suspicion and history intertwining. Each revelation suggested that the murder was not a sudden act, but the culmination of years of hidden grievances, carefully nurtured resentments, and desperate attempts to protect family secrets. As evening fell again, Miss Marple prepared for the next stage of her quiet pursuit. She knew the path ahead would require patience and subtlety, two qualities she possessed in abundance. The truth was close, though obscured by layers of deception and fear. And in Milchester, where the smallest detail could unravel the grandest design, Miss Marple was certain that soon the umbrella left open indoors would reveal its final secret. The dawn arrived pale and misty over Milchester, the village wrapped in a quiet anticipation that only the most observant might notice. For Miss Marple, the early morning hours were a sanctuary, a time when the world seemed to hold its breath before the day's bustle began. She sat by her window, the soft light falling on the little umbrella resting on the table beside her, its once innocuous presence now charged with meaning. Emily's discovery of the old letter had opened a window onto the past, yet it also deepened the mystery. What link did the century-old family feud have with the recent murder? And who among the villagers would be willing to kill to protect a secret long thought buried? Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the village library herself. The archivist, a mild-mannered gentleman named Mr. Phillips, greeted her warmly. He was aware of the heightened interest in the Greer estate and had been quietly assisting several inquiries. "I gathered you might want to see some of the original estate documents that survived the fire," Mr. Phillips said, leading her to a private reading room. "There are some charred fragments and reconstructed papers here. Not much, but enough to hint at the tangled ownership history." Miss Marple studied the fragile pages. Among them was a ledger with faded entries, one of which caught her eye. A note about a disputed transaction involving a piece of land called Heather's Hollow, located near the northern edge of the village. The transaction had been contested, records indicated, and a legal battle had ensued, that had divided families in the village for decades. "What can you tell me about Heather's Hollow, Mr. Phillips?" she asked. "Ah, that patch of land is notorious around here," he replied. "It's small but rich in history and the subject of many village stories. Some say it's cursed, others whisper about old family rivalries that never quite died down." Miss Marple's mind went back to Mr. Simmons. He had once expressed interest in land rights around the Greer estate, and his frequent unexplained appearances near the property were suspicious. Could Heather's Hollow be the fulcrum of these tensions? Later that day, Miss Marple arranged to meet with Inspector Barnaby at the village inn, where the soft murmur of conversation barely concealed the villagers' unease. Over cups of tea, they compared notes. "The solicitor, Alistair Crane, has been asking pointed questions about Heather's Hollow," Barnaby reported. "He claims to represent a client with a vested interest in the estate's unresolved affairs." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "A client with a stake in old grievances, perhaps? One who might find it advantageous to stir unrest or remove obstacles?" Barnaby nodded slowly. "Yes, but who? And why resort to murder? The more we dig, the more it feels like the past refuses to stay buried." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Emily Cartwright, breathless from her walk. "I found something," she said urgently, placing a small, worn envelope on the table. Inside was a photograph, yellowed with age, depicting a gathering at the Greer estate many years ago. In the photo, two men stood apart from the crowd, their expressions tense and guarded. One was unmistakably the late Mr. Hargreaves, but the other was a stranger, unfamiliar to most villagers. Miss Marple examined the image closely. "That man on the right. I wonder who he is." Emily shook her head. "I asked around, but no one seems to remember him. It's as if he was deliberately erased from local memory." Barnaby looked intrigued. "People do tend to forget what they prefer not to remember." Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. This unknown man might hold the key to the hidden resentments that had festered for years, a ghost in the history of the village whose presence now reverberated into the present. That evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor at her cottage. It was Alistair Crane himself, the solicitor. His demeanour was calm but carried an undercurrent of urgency. "I understand you've been looking into the Greer family history," he said politely. "I believe we share a common interest, uncovering the truth behind the disputes and, regrettably, the recent tragedy." Miss Marple gestured toward a seat, her eyes sharp yet welcoming. "Truth often has many layers, Mr. Crane, and not all who seek it do so for honest reasons." Crane smiled thinly. "Quite right. But sometimes the truth is inconvenient, dangerous. Even that is why I have come to Milchester to ensure my client's interests are protected. May I ask, who is your client?" she inquired, steady and curious. "Someone with deep roots in the village, though not immediately apparent," he replied. "Someone whose family was affected by past injustices related to Heather's Hollow." Miss Marple's gaze narrowed slightly. The plot thickened with each revelation. "And do you believe that injustice justifies murder?" Crane's expression hardened. "No one wishes for such outcomes. But when old wounds are reopened, passions can run high." The solicitor left soon after, but the weight of his visit lingered. His words confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. The murder was but a chapter in a long story of grudges and hidden betrayals. In the days that followed, the village felt the strain of unease. The local pub buzzed with whispers, and neighbours cast cautious glances at one another. Miss Marple noticed subtle shifts, furtive meetings, hushed phone calls, and a deepening atmosphere of suspicion. Her own investigation continued quietly. She paid another visit to the Greer estate, this time with a purpose to observe more closely the interactions between family members and those connected to the estate. She noticed how tensions flared in the smallest exchanges. A sharp word masked as a joke, a glance that lingered too long, a hesitation before answering a seemingly innocuous question. The web of relationships was dense, tangled with history and present fears. One afternoon, Miss Marple found herself speaking privately with Lucy Greer, the daughter of the late Mr. Hargreaves. Lucy was a woman of strong will and veiled sadness, her poised exterior masking a turbulent inner world. "I don't believe the police have the full story," Lucy confided softly. "There are things about my father's past, about his dealings and enemies, that no one wants to speak of. But I fear these secrets have come back to haunt us all." Miss Marple nodded, her empathy deepening. Secrets often bind families as tightly as love, sometimes more so. Lucy's eyes flickered with a mix of hope and despair. If only someone could see beyond the obvious and understand the real story. Miss Marple assured her gently, "I will do what I can." As the sun set over Milchester, casting long shadows over the familiar lanes and cottages, Miss Marple felt the invisible threads drawing tighter. The murder was not an isolated event, but a consequence of long-hidden truths. And somewhere in the Ruite village, the real murderer was watching, waiting, and perhaps already preparing the next move. The quiet game of revelation had begun, and Miss Marple was ready to play. The morning mist had scarcely lifted from the village green when Miss Marple found herself wandering toward the chapel, a place she had visited many times but now approached with a different purpose. The little church, with its ancient stone walls and stained glass windows, held stories as old as Milchester itself, and it was here she sensed that another piece of the puzzle awaited discovery. Inside the cool, hushed interior, she noticed Father Matthews arranging hymn books near the altar. He greeted her with a warm, if somewhat distracted, smile. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe this early visit?" he asked. "I find that places of worship often bear witness to more than just prayers," she said quietly. "Might I trouble you for a moment of your time?" The clergyman nodded, sensing the gravity in her tone. As they sat in one of the wooden pews, Miss Marple broached the subject delicately. "I wonder if you might recall anything unusual concerning the Greer family, or perhaps any visitors connected to the estate in recent weeks." Father Matthews stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Well, there was that gentleman who came to see me just last week. Quite an unexpected visitor. He seemed troubled, and I believe he mentioned Heather's Hollow, a name I don't often hear." "Did he give his name?" Miss Marple asked. "No, I'm afraid not. He was rather guarded. Said only that he wished to pray for a soul burdened by old wounds." That same afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll toward Heather's Hollow itself. The spot was a wild tangle of brambles and heather, bordered by ancient oaks whose branches arched protectively overhead. The village children called it a place of secrets, and now the detective understood why. As she examined the overgrown ground, a glint caught her eye. Kneeling carefully, she unearthed a small, tarnished locket entwined with roots. Inside was a faded photograph of two young women, one clearly recognizable as a youthful Lucy Greer. The other was a stranger, her eyes haunting and unreadable. Miss Marple's mind raced. This locket was more than a keepsake. It was a silent witness to a secret relationship, perhaps the very one Lucy had alluded to. Returning to her cottage, she pored over the village records once again, this time focusing on social ties rather than legal disputes. She cross-referenced names, dates, and connections. It became apparent that Lucy's family had long been entwined with another local lineage, the Whitmores, whose patriarch had passed away under suspicious circumstances decades ago. The realization struck Miss Marple. The Greer-Whitmore feud was not merely a backdrop to the village history, but a living force, shaping the present in unseen ways. Later, she received a visit from Emily Cartwright, who brought news of a recent discovery. I spoke with Mrs. Tibbet down at the bakery. She mentioned seeing Mr. Simmons near Heather's Hollow late last week, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Did she say what was in the package? No, but she thought it odd. He hurried away when she asked. That same evening, as the sun dipped low, Miss Marple found herself watching the Greer estate from a distance. A figure moved furtively near the edge of the property. It was Mr. Simmons. He paused, glanced about nervously, then slipped a small bundle beneath a loose stone by the garden wall. The detective resolved to investigate further at first light. The following day, with Inspector Barnaby by her side, Miss Marple unearthed the hidden bundle. Wrapped carefully were letters, not the legal kind but personal correspondence, filled with heartfelt pleas and bitter accusations. The letters were between the late Mr. Hargreaves and a mysterious correspondent, whose identity was veiled in initials. L.W. Among the papers was a letter dated just months before Mr. Hargreaves's death, hinting at a meeting at Heather's Hollow to resolve past grievances. But the tone was uneasy, suggesting that reconciliation might never have been possible. This changes things, Barnaby muttered. Who is L.W., and could they be connected to the current crime? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the faded photograph and the stranger in the locket. Lucy's right. The past is not done with this village. In the days that followed, Miss Marple observed the villagers with renewed attention. She noticed how some avoided certain topics, how others subtly changed their routes to avoid the Greer estate, and how the shadow of suspicion lengthened over them all. One afternoon, Miss Marple received a surprising call from Lucy Greer herself. The young woman was distressed, her voice trembling. Miss Marple, I must speak with you. There's something I have kept hidden, something I fear might be the key. Meeting in the privacy of Miss Marple's sitting room, Lucy revealed a truth she had long buried, a secret liaison with a member of the Whitmore family, the mysterious L.W. from the letters. They were my closest friend and confidant, Lucy said softly. But our family's hatred forced us apart. I fear that someone wanted to keep that secret hidden at all costs. Miss Marple's eyes met Lucy's with quiet understanding. Secrets, my dear, have a way of demanding their day in the light. As night deepened, the village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next piece to fall into place. Miss Marple felt the invisible threads of the past tightening around the present, and she knew the final unveiling was drawing near. But beneath the calm surface, a new danger stirred, one that threatened not only the truth, but the lives of those who sought it. The game was far from over, and Miss Marple was ready to meet it head-on. The following morning dawned with a pallid light filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room. Lucy Greer's visit had left a weighty impression on the elderly detective. That secret liaison, once a whispered shadow, now seemed the keystone to the mystery that bound the village in silence and fear. Miss Marple sat quietly, reflecting on Lucy's revelation, her mind weaving through the strands of the past and present. The letters between Mr. Hargreaves and the mysterious L.W., the initials now clearly identified as Lucy Whitmore, spoke of fragile hopes for reconciliation, yet hinted at resentment simmering beneath the surface. The feud between the Greers and Whitmores was no mere family quarrel. It was a tangled web of betrayal, loyalty, and old wounds reopened. As she prepared to visit the Whitmore estate, Miss Marple felt a subtle shift in the air, an unease as if the village itself held its breath, awaiting what was to come. The sun, though pale, climbed higher, casting long shadows across the winding lanes as she made her way toward the grand house on the village outskirts. The Whitmore estate was imposing, an elegant manor set within carefully tended gardens, its stone walls echoing with history. At the door stood Eleanor Whitmore, Lucy's aunt, and the current matriarch of the family. Her expression was guarded, lips pressed thin as she greeted Miss Marple. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said with a measured tone, "I hear you have questions. I hope they are not all about the past. That time should be left where it belongs." Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes kind but probing. "The past often shapes the present, Mrs. Whitmore. I believe understanding it may help us find the truth." Invited into the drawing room, Miss Marple noticed photographs lining the mantelpiece. Generations of Whitmores, stern-faced men and women, whose eyes seemed to watch over the room with silent judgment. Eleanor sat down, folding her hands tightly. "What would you like to know?" she asked cautiously. Miss Marple began by inquiring about the letters, carefully watching Eleanor's reactions. The woman's calm facade flickered for a moment, a subtle twitch at the corner of her mouth revealing something unspoken. "Yes, the letters," Eleanor admitted. "They were correspondence between my late brother Robert and my niece Lucy, but those words were private and painful. I had hoped they would never come to light." "Painful how?" Miss Marple pressed gently. Eleanor sighed, glancing toward the window. "Robert tried to bridge the divide between our families, but the resentment was deep, and not all were willing to forgive. There was an incident years ago that cast a long shadow. My brother never spoke of it openly, but it cost him dearly." "Do you believe that incident might connect to Mr. Hargreaves's death?" Miss Marple asked. Eleanor hesitated. "I cannot say for certain, but there were whispers, accusations, threats even. And when Robert died, the blame did not fall lightly." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. A young man entered, Charles Whitmore, Eleanor's son, Lucy's cousin. His eyes darkened with suspicion as they landed on Miss Marple. "Mother," he said stiffly, "why have you invited Miss Marple here? I thought this was a private matter." Eleanor looked at her son, then back at Miss Marple. "Because the past will not stay buried, Charles. And if we are to move forward, we must face it together." Charles's expression hardened. "I don't trust the village gossip nor the police's meddling." Miss Marple interjected softly, "Mr. Whitmore, I only seek the truth, which is the foundation for any justice." After the Whitmores had left the room, Miss Marple remained, pondering the fragile peace that seemed ready to shatter. She knew Charles's distrust was not merely youthful defiance, but perhaps a mask for something deeper, a protective shield for secrets best kept hidden. Her next visit was to the village pub, where the usual crowd gathered in low murmurs, their faces reflecting the unrest sweeping through Milchester. Here, Miss Marple found Mrs. Tibbet, the baker's wife, who had first mentioned Mr. Simmons's suspicious behaviour near Heather's Hollow. "Mrs. Tibbet," Miss Marple began, "have you noticed anything else unusual about Mr. Simmons or anyone else connected to the Greer or Whitmore families?" The woman wiped flour from her hands, frowning thoughtfully. "Well, Miss Marple, there's been talk, quiet talk, mind you, about arguments at the village hall. Some say Mr. Simmons and Charles Whitmore had a rather heated exchange not long ago." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "Arguments over what, do you know?" "Nothing clear, just hints of money and old grievances. Folks are tight-lipped about it." The detective nodded, sensing that financial tensions might have played a part in the growing animosity. It was not uncommon for old family disputes to intertwine with matters of inheritance and property, especially in a village where land and legacy meant everything. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself standing before the village hall, its walls echoing faintly with memories of town meetings and social events. She stepped inside and was immediately struck by the air of formality mingled with unease. The council clerk greeted her and confirmed that a dispute had indeed occurred. "Recently. It was over the proposed sale of some Whitmore land," he explained. Mr. Simmons opposed it vehemently while Mr. Whitmore was pushing for it. Words were exchanged, but nothing physical. Miss Marple's mind churned. Here was a motive born not only from history but from present-day conflicts. The web of resentment was growing more tangled. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple was deep in thought when a knock came at the door. It was Inspector Barnaby bearing news that shifted the investigation once again. "We found something at Heather's Hollow," Barnaby said gravely. "A second set of footprints, leading away from the scene, and more. A small vial, apparently containing poison." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. "Poison? That suggests premeditation and a willingness to resort to the most secretive means." Barnaby nodded. "We're running tests, but it complicates the case. This wasn't a simple crime of passion." The revelation sent a ripple through Miss Marple's thoughts. Poison was a weapon wielded by those who preferred subtlety and control, those who believed the deadliest blows should be hidden in plain sight. That evening, Miss Marple invited Lucy Greer for tea. The young woman was visibly shaken by the new development. "Do you think someone among us would go so far as to poison?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling. "Human nature, my dear, is often more complex than it appears." Miss Marple replied softly. "But that vial is a vital clue. It tells us the killer planned carefully, wanted to ensure the deed was done without witnesses." Lucy's eyes darted toward the window, as if expecting someone to appear. "I fear we are not safe," she whispered. Miss Marple nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. The tangled roots of past betrayals, present quarrels, and hidden motives were entwined in a dangerous embrace. The killer, whoever they were, had yet to make their final move, and the detective was determined to be ready. In the quiet moments, before sleep, Miss Marple's mind circled back to the photograph in the locket, the letters buried beneath a loose stone, and the whispered threats once concealed by time. The puzzle pieces were nearly aligned, but one final test remained, a delicate psychological dance that only the keenest observer could master. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, subtle confrontations, and the delicate unraveling of a mystery that reached deep into the heart of Milchester. For now, Miss Marple prepared herself to step into the shadows where truth and danger mingled, knowing that the final unveiling was close at hand. The morning sun filtered softly through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting gentle patterns upon the worn wooden floorboards. The village of Milchester had settled into a tense quiet since the discovery of the vial, but the uneasy calm was more a holding of breath than a true peace. The next phase of the investigation had arrived, and with it, the subtle but deliberate moves of those desperate to protect secrets long buried. Miss Marple was not a woman to be rushed, but she had always known that time could be an enemy to truth. With the threads of the mystery pulling taut around her, she prepared for what would be her final test, a delicate engagement with the suspect whose behavior had most disturbed her in recent days, Charles Whitmore. Her decision to confront Charles was not taken lightly. Throughout the investigation, his defensive sharpness and subtle evasions had drawn her attention, but more than that was a flicker of something far more telling, a faint tremor in his manner whenever the past was mentioned, as though he were guarding a fragile truth. Now it was time to unravel it. She sent a polite note requesting his presence at her cottage that afternoon, careful to cloak her intentions behind the pretense of a neighborly chat. When Charles arrived, there was a momentary flash of surprise in his eyes before his usual guarded composure returned. He was tall and imposing, but there was a tension beneath his calm exterior that Miss Marple recognized well. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Whitmore," she began warmly, offering him a cup of tea. "I wanted to talk to you about the past and about Milchester, and about how sometimes the smallest things can reveal the largest truths." Charles sat, his posture rigid. "I'm not sure I understand, Miss Marple." She smiled, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Do you remember the day of the garden party, when Mr. Hargreaves was found dead?" Charles nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "There was an umbrella," she continued, "left open indoors. A small, odd thing to do, would you not agree?" Charles frowned. "Yes, my mother mentioned it. It seemed careless." "Or deliberate," Miss Marple suggested quietly. "Little details like that often reveal much about a person's state of mind or their intentions." Charles's eyes flickered briefly toward the window. "What are you implying?" "That the crime was planned with care, that whoever did it wanted to send a message, perhaps one hidden in plain sight." She paused, watching his reaction closely. "You and Mr. Simmons had a disagreement about the land, I understand. Was it simply business, or was there something more?" Charles's expression hardened, then softened in a way that suggested a conflict within. "There were old family wounds, yes, but I did not kill Robert Hargreaves." Miss Marple nodded, accepting the denial but noting the subtle defensive tone. "Tell me about your relationship with your cousin, Lucy. The letters mention her often." Charles hesitated, then sighed. "Lucy and we were close once, but the past kept driving a wedge between us. The feud between our families was like a shadow that never left." "Did you ever speak to her after the letters stopped?" "Rarely. Things became complicated. Our family's disputes took precedence over our personal ties." Miss Marple let the silence linger, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "You said your mother hoped the past would stay buried. Why do you think she invited me to speak with you?" Charles gave a bitter smile. "Perhaps she knows the truth is safer when kept hidden, but secrets have a way of coming to light." Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. "That they do. And sometimes the truth can be the heaviest burden of all." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. It was Inspector Barnaby, his expression serious. "Miss Marple, I've just received word from the lab. The poison found in the vial is a rare but natural toxin, derived from the hemlock plant." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Hemlock? A deliberate and cruel choice." Barnaby nodded grimly. "Yes, and it matches the symptoms Robert Hargreaves exhibited before his death. Dizziness, confusion. We believe he was slowly poisoned over several days." Charles's face paled. "Slowly. Then this wasn't a crime of passion, it was calculated." "Exactly," Barnaby confirmed. "We're looking at a patient-precise killer." Miss Marple turned her gaze back to Charles, who now seemed visibly unsettled. "Mr. Whitmore, does this new detail change anything for you?" Charles shook his head, but the mask of calm was slipping. "No, but I swear I had no part in it." Miss Marple studied him carefully, sensing the turmoil beneath his defenses. After Barnaby took his leave, Miss Marple and Charles sat in silence for a few moments. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken truths. "Mr. Whitmore," Miss Marple said, softly, "if you are innocent, you must help us understand who is not." Charles looked up, meeting her steady gaze. "I will," he promised. Over the next days, as the investigation pressed forward, Miss Marple gathered the villagers once more. She watched carefully, noting every glance, every hesitation. The web of lies and half-truths was unraveling, revealing more about human nature than any straightforward confession ever could. She learned of long-held resentments, whispered alliances, and betrayals disguised as friendships. The once peaceful village was a stage for subtle power plays, each player acting under the shadow of fear and hope. One evening, as dusk deepened and the village settled into quiet, Miss Marple sat alone, considering the puzzle in its entirety. The umbrella left open indoors, the rare poison, the fractured family ties. Each piece was vital, but none was complete alone. She knew the final act was near. To catch the killer, she would have to draw them out, to expose the mask behind their careful deception. The following day, with a calm and deliberate air, Miss Marple arranged for a gathering at the village hall, a place heavy with history and the memory of conflicts past. She invited all who had played a part in the drama, ensuring each would be present. As the villagers assembled, murmurs of speculation filled the room, the air thick with tension. Miss Marple stood before them, serene and composed, and began to speak. Her voice was gentle but carried the unmistakable weight of certainty. "Milchester has been shaken by a grievous loss," she said, "and by the shadows of secrets that have long lingered among us. It is time for those shadows to be brought into the light." She paused, scanning the faces before her, some anxious, others defiant. Robert Hargreaves's death was not the result of a moment's fury, but a slow, deliberate act. Poison was used, a toxin drawn from hemlock, and the crime was planned with chilling precision. A hush fell over the room. Yet, the evidence is not only in what was done, but in what was left behind. The umbrella open indoors, a small but telling sign. It was a signal, a message, and only one among us would understand its meaning fully. Miss Marple's eyes rested on Charles Whitmore, who straightened at the implication. The past feud between the Greers and Whitmores was a painful backdrop, but the motive goes deeper. It is a story of betrayal, of love and jealousy, and ultimately of desperation. She turned to the assembled villagers. "I ask each of you to reflect, for the truth is near. The one who believed their carefully woven lies would protect them is mistaken. The truth will reveal itself tonight." The room remained still, the weight of her words hanging in the air. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple prepared to reveal the truth that would end the mystery and restore, as much as possible, the fragile peace of Milchester. But she knew, as always, that the unveiling was not merely about justice, it was about understanding the depths and frailties of the human heart. The village hall was heavy with anticipation as the evening shadows lengthened and the small crowd gathered once more. Miss Marple stood quietly at the front, her hands folded calmly, eyes reflecting the sharp intelligence that had steadily unraveled the threads of this tangled mystery. Around her, the faces of Milchester's residents, some anxious, others wary, watched and waited, sensing that the moment of truth had arrived. Miss Marple began softly, her voice steady but infused with the quiet authority born of experience. "We have all witnessed how appearances can deceive, how the smallest detail can be a beacon in the darkness. It was the umbrella, left open indoors during the garden party, that first drew my attention. An oddity, yes, but deliberate." Paused, allowing her words to settle, then continued. "This umbrella was not merely a careless oversight. It was a message, a signal meant to be seen by a particular person. It echoed a gesture from long ago, when secrets were first buried beneath the polite facades of this village." Turning slightly, she fixed her gaze on Charles Whitmore. "Charles, you told me of your strained relationship with your cousin Lucy and the bitterness that divided your families. You spoke honestly about your past, but there was something you did not reveal." Charles shifted uneasily. "I have told you everything, Miss Marple." "Perhaps not everything," she replied gently. "You see, it was not you who left the umbrella open. It was Lucy. And more importantly, it was Lucy who knew the secret behind Robert Hargreaves's death, because it was she who gave him the vial containing the hemlock toxin." Gasps rippled through the room. Miss Marple raised a hand for silence. Lucy feared Robert would reveal a scandal that would destroy the Greer family name forever. She sought to stop him, not with open violence, but with a slow, quiet poison. Yet, in doing so, she believed she could disguise her actions as misfortune. At that moment, the door opened quietly, and Lucy entered, her face pale but resolute. She met Miss Marple's gaze without fear. "I never meant for Robert to die," Lucy said softly, "only to silence him long enough to protect my family." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but unwavering. "And in protecting secrets, many lives were damaged, families torn apart, trust broken. But truth, like water, finds its way through even the smallest cracks." Lucy lowered her eyes. "I will face whatever comes." But I needed the village to understand. Miss Marple turned back to the assembled crowd. "Let this be a lesson, dear friends. Our lives here, peaceful as they seem, are woven from the complexities of human hearts, full of love, jealousy, hope, and fear. It is our kindness and our honesty that must bind us now, to heal and to move forward." As the villagers absorbed her words, the tension began to ease. Charles looked relieved, though still burdened by the family wounds. The village, shaken but stronger, faced a future where old secrets no longer held sway. Later, alone in her cozy sitting room, Miss Marple reflected quietly. The crime was solved, but the human story behind it lingered, reminding her, as always, that the sharpest mysteries lie not just in what we see, but in what we choose to hide. And so, Milchester settled once more into its gentle rhythms, the umbrella closed at last, and the truth resting softly among its people.